Hello and welcome to yet another Blender tutorial. So today we're going to start into what I described last week as project-based learning. What that means is we're going to start working on a project, a scene that we're going to span multiple videos for. The first one will be pretty simple. Today the main point of the video is to introduce to you textures and how to use textures. With that we're going to need to learn UV maps, what are called UV maps. So let's jump into it. The first thing I want to show you the first thing I want to go over is a couple of prefaces, a couple of things that I need to get out of the way. The first is there are many ways to make a model in Blender. There's no one right way. There are better ways and worse ways, but really it comes down to how good it looks in the end. And then the next thing I want to say is if you're following along the videos and you understand them very well, you know almost as much as I do at this point. I am by no means an expert at Blender, and I am by no means a professional at Blender. It's more of a hobby for me, and I just enjoy making these videos and helping out other people. The other thing I want to mention and get out of the way is if you are just joining us, my startup file has been altered. You'll notice I no longer have a lamp, and we are going to be working this whole video in Cycles render engine. We're not going to be using the Blender render engine. So at the very top in the middle, like I just did, you need to change the Cycles render to Blender render. I'm going to turn on my screencast keys, and with that said, we're going to jump into this tutorial. So today we're going to talk about textures, like I said. We learned about materials before using the nodes, and we got them to be able to change to different colors and to interact with the light in a different way. So I'm going to pull up this timeline like I did last time, and I'm going to change it to a node editor because we're going to be using nodes quite a bit. And the thing I want to do is I want to basically make a floor and two walls, and that way we can point the camera in one direction and have a floor and two walls and have that cover the whole scene. That way we don't need a third wall, and we don't need a fourth wall, obviously, because the camera is going to be pointed in such a way so there's one wall here and one wall here kind of diagonally into it. And then what I want to do, that's going to be the point of today, is to get those floor and walls and make them look nice. Then after that, I don't know why this scene came to mind. I want to make a bar stool, and I want to make like a milkshake glass on top of that with milkshake in it in other tutorials. Those will be probably the next two. This one though, I want to go over the texture for the floor and the walls. So with the floor and the walls, we actually don't need any thickness to them because they're going to appear flat on the camera. Because of the angle, we don't really need any thickness to the floor, we don't need any thickness to the walls. We just need to have a face that shows well. So to be able to view what we're doing, the first thing I'm going to do is just set up some generic lighting. I'm going to add a plane with Shift A. I'm going to make that plane, well, first I'll scale it to about 5 times its size. Seems kind of big, but then we'll grab it and move it up along the Z-axis by pressing Z after we grab. Then I'm going to move it along the X a little, move it along the Y a little, get it a little back behind the camera. Then I'm going to rotate it so it's pointing toward the scene. And I'm going to come in to its material properties. Remember, that's the little circle over here. While this is selected, I'm going to press new, and I'm going to change the surface to a emission shader. If you recall, that will make it give off light. So we have it emitting light, and that's what the surface is. And I'm going to change the strength down here in my node editor to about 30. Okay. So that's just some generic lighting for our scene. That way we can preview everything. We may come back and edit that later. But for now, I'm going to name the plane to lighting. And now we're going to work on the floor and the walls. So Shift A to add a plane for the floor. I'm going to scale it about 10 times so we get a nice big floor. And then I'm going to Shift A for another mesh, and we're going to go plane. And we're going to rotate this one along the x-axis 90 degrees. And then we're going to scale it 10 times its size. And we're going to grab it and move it along the y-axis. I think 10. Yeah, 10, and that'll line up just right with this wall. And then we're going to grab it and move it along the z-axis. 10. Perfect. So I'll do that one more time with all the directions opposite. So x and y will switch to go to this other side. Go Shift A to add a plane. Scale with S 10 times the size. I typed in 10. Hit enter. Now I'm going to rotate along the y-axis this time 90 degrees. So I typed in 90. Hit enter. I'm going to grab it and I'm going to move it, I think, -10 along the x-axis. Then I'm going to grab it again and I'm going to move it +10 along the z-axis. So I hit Z and 10 and then hit enter. Okay, I know I'm moving fast, but this should be pretty basic to you guys if you've been following along so far. So this is the scene I want to set up, and we're going to go over how to get good textures on this. If we look right now, I'm going to change to rendered mode so I don't have to do the quick preview. We have everything as bright, white, generic. It's white because the light's so bright on it. There's actually no material applied to any of this so far. So I'm going to, first thing is go back to solid in the preview mode. Now I'm going to come over to my outliner and I'm going to name this plane floor. I know it's the floor because the floor became highlighted in orange. I'm going to name this plane wall 1. I'm going to name the other one wall 2 in no particular order. Now, next thing I want to introduce is a website called that a lot of people use for artistic purposes. A website on the internet called CG Textures. Now you can see here, this is the web address CG Textures. And CG Textures, you do have to register an account, but all of these textures are free, and they let you download up to 15 megabytes of their textures every day, which is, you know, a really good amount. You can actually download 10 or 15 good quality textures every day. And I would really recommend, if you're going to be looking for textures, to try this website. They have quite a collection. They don't have everything, but the ones they have are pretty good quality. I'm going to be using a floor made of black and white tile, and the one I'm going to be using is, if you want to search it, you can see underneath the preview here, it's called floors checkerboard 0037_5. So you can search for that or just search checkerboard. Then that's going to be the floor. Then I'm going to be using this white plaster for the walls, and this one is called Plaster White 0074, and there's a texture number and everything. So you can search that. You can use whatever textures you would like. Keep in mind that the size of these textures are going to be roughly a 4:3 aspect ratio. And what I mean by that is that the width is the width to height is a ratio of 4:3. So about 1600 to 1200. That is true of both of the textures. So we'll use that to scale the textures then in our program, because our planes that we made, let me go back to Blender, the planes that we made are square. They're 1:1 ratio, so we can actually scale that using node to scale. Okay, just keep that in mind. Now let's work on the floor. So I'm going to right click on the floor. I'm going to add a new texture, and the floor, I will leave it diffuse for now, and I'll show you. Actually, no, I'm going to go glossy. I want it to be a glossy tile to reflect a little bit, and I'll show you a little more about that later. Okay, but I want, instead of a color, instead of choosing, say, green, and let me change my preview up here. Instead of having that nice glossy green, I want a picture in its stead. So what I'll do is in this node editor, I'll come down and I'll Shift A, and I'll go to Texture, and Image Texture. And I'll add this node here, and I'll go to Color and connect the color. And you'll notice it went to purple. Purple is the this bright magenta, fuchsia, whatever you want to call it, is I guess the default color for a node texture. Now I'm going to click on this image texture node. There's an open button to open the file. And my file is right here, Floors Checkerboard. So I opened it, and you'll notice it's not quite right. Now the reason it's not quite right is because it does not have a UV map. A UV map is important for 3D textures because all texture files, all image files, are two-dimensional. They only have up and down. They only have length and width. And 3D objects have 3 dimensions. Even though we're working with planes, we still have to translate 3 dimensions of our object into the 2 dimensions of the texture. The way this is done is with what's called a UV map. And the easiest way to show you this is to go back to Solid on your 3D view window. Then click up here on the very top header. There's a screen layout you can choose. We talked about this briefly. One of the default layouts is UV editing. If you click on that, it'll show a 3D view window on the right, and it'll show the UV editor on the left. Now, all we have to do for a plane, it can get a little more complicated for more complex things, but all we have to do for a plane is select the object, tab into edit mode, and with everything selected, all we have to do is come over to the Shading UVs tab, click on this Unwrap, and choose Unwrap. And that's all we have to do. Now what that does is this square here represents any texture, and we can actually, down in this bottom, we can open up a picture. I think mine should already be there because I opened it somewhere else, so it knows that I'm using this one. So you can click either open, or you can, if you've already opened it, you can click on the little image to pull it up and see the ones that are already opened. And I can show it here, and you can zoom out with the scroll wheel. And you'll notice that it'll show you what the texture is, and then these vertices and these lines correspond directly to the vertices in the 3D view window. For example, if I select in the 3D view window just one corner back here, it will should select it in here. Maybe, oh, it's faces. If I could select the faces, so I'm going to hit A to select everything. And if I want to just select this corner, I can actually change how the texture will be stretched or how it will fit. And this is important when you have more complex structures, or complex textures and complex models. So essentially my plane with its 4 points is transposed onto this image right here. We'll get into more about UV mapping for now, but the most important thing you need to remember when UV mapping is switch to this UV editing mode, and then you want to go into edit mode on the 3D view window, go to Shading UVs, make sure every part of that image, or every part of that model that you want to be unwrapped or to use textures on, you need to select it. And then you click unwrap and unwrap. If it didn't work, you probably didn't select everything. Okay, so with that said, we don't really need to change anything. It's a plane, so it's really easy to fit. And we can switch back to the default view. And there we go. So now if we go into our rendered shading, we can see we have our tile. Now, with this tile, it's not quite fitting correctly. So what we can do, first of all, is we want to add a input UV map, so we know we're using the right UV map. It's not always necessary, and you can choose all the different UV maps from here. We're just using the default one that we just made. So, excuse me. So we're going to now add a new node that we haven't looked at before, and this one will let us scale the texture how we would like. So I'm going to go Shift A, and I'm going to go to, let's see, this one's called mapping. So I'm going to go to vector, and I'm going to go to mapping. And I'm going to just click it right on where I want to insert it. I want to put it between UV map and image texture. And you'll notice that line is orange now. If I click it on top, it'll just automatically insert it between the UV map and the image texture. Now this is a big node. I'll try and zoom in so we can see it well. But this node lets us essentially, I'm going to go to texture here because we're going to be mapping a texture. It lets us change the scale, it lets us change the offset, the location, and it lets us rotate it even. So it's a pretty powerful node for working with textures. Because of the aspect ratio of the 4:3, you can actually see that these squares are stretched a little bit as they're fit to this. The squares in the tile have been stretched because the texture was stretched to fit to the square floor that we have. So it had to stretch that. I'm going to unstretch it, and I did this by playing around a little bit. Basically, the X we want to go by a third, and the Y we want to go by a quarter. And that'll get rid of the 4:3 or make it at least fit a 1:1. Now we have this nice tile floor. I'll let it catch up. I'm actually going to change my render settings to make this a little easier to see so it doesn't freeze all the time. I'm going to change my sampling to just 5 for the preview. Now what that means is it'll only do 5 quick passes and you can get a quick idea of what everything looks like. Okay? So the next thing I want to do is show you why we don't just want a simple glossy shader. And the reason we don't want a glossy shader is because it's too glossy. It's almost like a mirror. If we go to our wall and we add in a material, I just went to material and click new, and let's say we want to change the color to green. Okay, and we went to our other wall and we're still in the text, or still in the material, add a new material, and we want to change the color to green. Now you'll notice our checkerboard floor is now really green. We didn't want that before, or we don't want that. We want it to be white and black. It's a little too reflective, and we are going to change that by giving it only a little bit of gloss. And if you remember, the way to do this is to add another shader. We're going to add the Diffuse Shader. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I'm going to add the Diffuse Shader. Then I'm going to Shift A and add another shader called the Mix Shader. And the mix shader is going to go in between and combine the diffuse and the glossy. Okay. I'm going to change the roughness a little bit just so it doesn't reflect too much. And then I'm going to change the mix shader probably up to about 6.7. I think this is how I wanted it last time. Now, our light is a little too strong here. So I'm going to move it. I'm going to here I should change back to solid so you can actually see what I'm doing. Okay. So the light's a little too strong. The floor was all whitewashed. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to grab it, move it along the z-axis. Click on the light, grab it, move it along the z-axis, and make it quite a bit higher. Okay. Then I'm just going to hit F12. Get a real quick view here. Alright, still a bit strong, so I'm going to change the strength down to maybe 20. And hit F12. Okay. Now, I'm going to click on the floor, and I'm going to actually change the shader. I think I went the opposite way. I think what I did was reverse these. Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't even connected the diffuse shader yet. That's the problem. So I can actually connect the image texture to both the diffuse node and the glossy node. You can have two coming out of a node. You can't have two going into a node. So with that said, which should look pretty good now. If we go to rendered, you can see we have bright green walls, but our floor still maintains enough of its whiteness. You can see it's a little glossy. It still reflects a little bit of that green, but see, we can actually slide the shader, and this is all glossy. It's all green, super shiny. And then we go to 1 and it's not shiny at all. So to get a little bit of the gloss, we're going to go to a factor of about 6 or 7, somewhere in there. And that should be good. Okay? So that's our floor. I know it's kind of complex, the nodes, but let's go over what they do again. We have a UV map. This tells the texture how to put itself onto the 3D object. Again, we'll go into more detail on complex UV maps later, but for now, just know that it's how you put the texture onto the object. The UV actually stands, or it's not an acronym, but it represents the coordinate system that it uses. Instead of X and Y, it uses U and V for the transformation. It's how it transforms it. So after the UV map, we feed the vector in, and we have this mapping node. And this tells us, well, even though we told you with this UV map how to map the texture, we're going to change that. We're going to scale it differently, and we can rotate it or we can offset it if you want. Okay, that feeds it in to, that's the directions for the image texture. Now the image is just the checkerboard that we downloaded from the CG Textures website. That would be this one. Okay, that's just the straight image that we loaded in here, and we feed the color into our shader, our glossy and our diffuse, because we don't want it 100% glossy or 100% diffuse. I'm actually going to turn this roughness down. And you notice when we fed in this image texture to these shaders, we can no longer pick a color on them. They used to have a color before, like we chose green for the walls. We've replaced that color selection with the image itself. And then with the two shaders, we've combined them with this mix shader and fed all of that to the material output of the surface. So take a minute and look at it, and make sure you're comfortable with everything we just did. It's a little more complicated than what we did in the previous tutorial with the two shaders in a mix. I think I introduced the mix shader before. This time we're feeding in the image and we're mapping it and all that good stuff. Okay? So, a couple of things to know. If your image does not show up, if your texture does not show up on your floor, make sure you've UV unwrapped your model, and make sure that you have loaded it in correctly into your image texture, and that all of your nodes are connected. And then if you have questions, it's very helpful to post a picture of your node setup, and that way people can look at it and they can see. Alright, so with that said, let's move on to the walls. Green's actually not a great color for the walls. We're going to make them that white plaster. And I'm just going to right click on a wall. I can do that in rendered mode. I'll go back to solid mode just so you guys can see. I'm going to click on a wall. I have my material output. I have my diffuse BSDF. I'm going to leave it all diffuse. I'm not going to have a mix shader on this one, but I'm going to add in my image texture. Shift A to add an image texture. Then I'll just click here to set it, drag my color over, and I'm going to open the plaster white. Okay, that was the one I showed you in the beginning. Now it's not UV unwrapped, but I can actually just right click and I can right click on the floor, select the mapping node and shift to select the UV map as well. I can just control copy these, go back to my other object by right clicking on it, and I can how do you copy and paste? Maybe not. I know there's a way to copy and paste node setups, but I forgot. So I'm just going to add them in manually, and this one's going to need a UV map, which we don't have yet, and we're going to add a vector mapping. So very similar to the other one, except we don't have the mix shader. Okay, with that said, let's now unwrap this wall by going to the UV editing view. It still has this checkerboard loaded in. You can actually change it now to the plaster white. And then with our wall selected, we're going to tab into edit mode, make sure everything's selected, and we're just going to click unwrap and unwrap. Okay, that's all we need to do. Now we can go back to our default view, and since we have our node set up already, I don't remember what the scale is for this one because it's oriented differently. Let's see, the X and the Y are going to be Z and X. So we'll try 0.33 for Z and try 0.25 for X. We'll see if that works. I don't know. I haven't tested this out, but we're going to go into our rendered view and give it a second to load up so you guys can see it. You'll notice we have this white plaster wall. I'm going to dolly up a little so you guys can see it. Okay, so it looks a little bit stretched. You might want to play around with the scale. In fact, I might just turn it all back to 1 and let it be, because I think it's fine like that. The other thing now is just to do it to the other wall. So let's actually go into our node setup, Click A a couple of times to select everything. And then I think it's Shift D. No, it's not. That just duplicates everything. Alright, we're going to set this up again like normal. So we're going to go back to our solid view. I'm going to find this other wall in object mode. And we have a material output. I'm going to Shift A all of the nodes I need, which are UV map, Shift A vector mapping, and then the last one is Shift A texture, image texture. Now we're going to connect all of our nodes. We're going to load in. We don't have to click open, we can just click the pull down, and we've already loaded in Plaster, so we can just click that one. I'm going to change the roughness to 1 because it's Plaster. And now we just have to UV unwrap it for it to show up. You can see if we go to rendered now, it's not showing up, it's all just gray. And the reason is because we haven't UV unwrapped it. So go back to solid. I'm going to change the view to UV editing. I'm going to, in object mode, select the one I want, and then tab into edit mode. I'm going to unwrap, make sure it's, the plane matches the texture here, and then that's all I need to do, so I can actually go back to default, tab to object mode, and then we're going to just change this to rendered one more time and get a final look at it. So this is the scene we've set up. It's by no means amazing, but it is a good introductory scene. I know some of this was fast-paced. I know a lot of it was new. But here's what we did, just as a refresher. We took a 3D object. We applied this UV map, which is kind of like a hidden texture. And the UV map told the real texture how to appear. And we then used that to load in some pre-made textures from the CG Textures website that I had downloaded, and we told the light how to behave, and that's with the shader. Notice the walls are diffused because they're not going to reflect anything. Our floor should be a little bit glossy. We can actually right click on that here, and maybe want them a little more glossy because the light's a little more dim. Probably not. We can actually just ramp up the light at this point. Say 25 or 30. And that's the scene that we'll use now. What I want to do in the next tutorial is probably set up a bar stool. Help you guys to model a bar stool. Now that we have a lot of this out of the way, we can focus on how to make models. And so I'll look into making a bar stool. I have some really good ideas to make that simple. And we'll then texture it. And then the next tutorial after that, probably do the milkshake. And that I'm looking into it, may involve a simulation to do the liquid. So if you guys have questions, remember it helps to post or at least describe in detail your node setup. And pictures help, and be as specific as possible, because now that we're getting into more complex stuff, it's really hard to know exactly what to do to help, but I'm glad to answer questions. If you guys have questions, post them below the video. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.